All right, well, hello again. I hope you had a good break. This is our third and last panel on defense cooperation among allies in the Asia Pacific. We have a tremendous panel for you. I will now turn to Cleo Paskal, who will chair this panel, and we have wonderful panelists. So Cleo, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Jonathan. This has been a great day. I've been in and out all day and learned an enormous amount. So we may be last, and usually I'd say we're going to be the best, but the bar is pretty high. But I think if anybody can do it, it's going to be this gang. This is a very good group of people who have wide knowledge in an area that's critical going forward. So I'll introduce them all quickly. I would remind them that they've got about 20 minutes maximum each. We have excellent translators working, so don't speak as fast as I'm speaking. And if you have questions, please put them in the side and we'll get to them later. So the order we're gonna go in is the order that you have in the booklet. So we'll start with Hyon Yu, who's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Trinity University. She specializes in US alliances, East Asian security, China's foreign policy, Korean politics, and international relations theory. It's a very big remit. Hyon Yu's articles have appeared in various journals, including the Australian Journal of International Affairs, International Relations of the Asia Pacific, and Asian Perspective. She has a PhD from Georgetown. She'll talk to us about the problems of trilateral cooperation among the US, Japan, and South Korea in addressing China. It's a very hot topic at the moment. After that, we'll have Lauren Richardson, who's a lecturer in the Department of International Relations at the Australian National University. She specializes on the role of non-state actors in shaping diplomatic interactions in Northeast Asia, particularly Japan-Korea relations. She's also a member of the Australian Committee of the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific and a board member of the ANU Korea Institute. She's currently completing a book on reshaping Japan-Korea relations. She's going to talk to us about dealing with the North Korean nuclear problem, convergence and divergence between the US, Japan, and South Korea. So we're going to be looking at the same grouping, but from different angles, which should give us some good depth on the topic. Then we'll have Nick Bisley, who's the Dean and Head of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and Professor of International Relations at the Trobe University. Nick is also a Fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the Secretary of the Council of Australasian Deans of Art, Social Sciences, and Humanities. His research and teaching expertise is in Asia's international relations, great power politics, and Australian foreign and defense policy. He's written a lot and on a wide range of topics, and all very interesting. And he's regularly quoted in the national and international media. He has a PhD from the London School of Economics. He'll talk to us about Australia's defense strategy, I think, which has come up a few times already today, especially in the context of AUKUS, so it'll be good to hear from somebody there. Rigidity in the face of fluidity. So here we go, and we'll start off with Hyon Yu. Take it away. You have about maximum 20 minutes, and really looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Hello, everyone. Good morning from Korea. I'm located in Korea, and it's 4:30 a.m. in the morning. I hope that I could hold my brain until the end of this session. And thank you very much, Cleo, for introduction. And I would like to thank Jonathan and Laval University for organizing this event and inviting me to participate. Why don't I share my PowerPoint? Ooh. Okay. So it was frozen a little bit, but I'm going to begin my presentation. So today's topic is related with the problems, difficulties, and limits of cooperation, trilateral cooperation among the United States, Japan, and South Korea. I actually moved from the United States to Korea very recently, so I'm now located in Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul, Korea. But I was in the Trinity University. The most difficulties and the limits of trilateral cooperation come from the divergent views by Japan and South Korea on the regional challenges. Both Asian countries, Japan and Korea, are facing the uncertainties of a security environment in the region, but they differ in interpreting and addressing these regional challenges. To that extent, I would like to address North Korea and China, but I understand that Lauren is going to talk about the North Korea more in depth. So I'm going to address North Korea in a brief way. And then I'll also talk about the challenges within the United States, particularly under the Trump administration. The challenges come within the trilateral alliance partners. These alliance partners, and also the historical issues that are located in Japan and South Korea. So first of all, to deal with North Korea, both Japan and South Korea perceive major threats from North Korea because North Korea has weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons, biological and chemical weapons. And both of them are located within the range of North Korea's ballistic missiles. But in terms of the conventional threats, two countries have different views. As you can see here, the South Korea faces thousands of artilleries located near the border, 38 parallel, and they can reach the Seoul and a little bit farther to the Seoul, which is the capital city of Korea. The North Korea has a 1.1 million men in the army, but naval and air equipment is negligible. So the Japan is sort of out of range in terms of North Korea's conventional forces. And the South Korean people view that the unification with the North Korea, unification of the Korean Peninsula is the most important goal for their entire life. North Korea is a target of communication and cooperation. On the other hand, Japan sees North Korea as a rogue state, violating international law, abducting Japanese civilians. So Japan is less concerned about this ultimate goal of South Korea to unify the Korean Peninsula. Japan is more concerned about these general weapons of mass destruction and the abduction of the Japanese civilians. To that extent, these two countries have some similarities, but at the same time, this divergence. And second, the challenge from China, both Japan and South Korea observe uncertainties from the rising China's influence in the region, in the economic as well as military arena. To talk about this economic arena first, both Japan and South Korea are vulnerable to the Chinese economic tool as a foreign policy, in a sense that they rely on the Chinese market for their economic growth. The Japanese top two trading partner include the United States and China. The US and China almost occupies a similar share of the Japanese trade with the foreign countries, almost 19%. The South Korea's largest trading partner is China. The 21.31% of the South Korea's traded with other countries. The second largest, United States, and the third largest, Japan, combined together, almost similar to the Chinese share in South Korea's trade with foreign countries. So that means that these two countries are relying on China to a great deal economically. Both countries are exposed to the Chinese increasing military prowess, and they perceive threats from the Chinese military activities, particularly located in South China Sea. The South China Sea is important for Japan and South Korea, particularly because of the oil supply that they receive from the Middle East coming through the South China Sea area. They go through the Malacca Strait, which is the entry point of the South China Sea, and throughout the South China Sea. Almost 2/3 of South Korea's energy supplies go through this area, and nearly 60% of the Japanese energy supplies and also Taiwanese energy supplies go through this area. And 80% of the crude oil supply flow through the South China. The 80% of Chinese crude oil import flow through the South China Sea area. The cost of rerouting oil tankers via the Lombok Strait and the east of the Philippines is tremendous. The cost would be at $600 million per annum for Japan and $270 million per annum for South Korea. So both countries share common interests in securing oil supply route in the South China Sea. So the freedom of navigation is an important principle for both of them, Japan and South Korea. And they believe that China's activities should be monitored in this area. However, the responses of Japan differ from those of Korea. In terms of Japan, particularly after Japan experienced troubles with the Chinese provocation in the Senkaku-Diaoyu area, which is East China Sea, in 2010 and 2012, Japan started to align East China Sea problem with the South China Sea. Japan views that the Chinese activities are unpredictable, challenging and changing the status quo, violating international law. Japan is particularly concerned about the China's gray zone operations in the East China Sea and South China Sea. The China's violation of sovereignty of Japan by traversing within the waters near the Senkaku/Diaoyu Island. Japan also observing these Chinese creating artificial islands and placing military equipment in those islands in the South China Sea. So Japan participates in response to the Chinese activities. Japan participates in the US effort to secure and enforce the freedom of navigation based on the UNCLOS. So Japan strongly support the ruling of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, PCA, on the South China Sea dispute between the Philippines and China. And Japan also emphasizes cooperation with the regional powers in order to resist the Chinese military activities to change the status quo in this area in the region, relying on the Diamond security link that was introduced and suggested by the Prime Minister Abe in 2007, and also based on the freedom and open Indo-Pacific strategy introduced by also the Prime Minister Abe in 2016, which includes enforcing the strategic relations with Australia and India. Japan, in line with this, Japan also had informal meetings with the ASEAN countries in 2014. Japan also had a 2+2 meeting with Indonesia in 2015. So all these activities are directed at the Chinese activities in this region and the Chinese threat in general. And as you know, that Japan is a major member of the Quad. However, South Korea's response is a little bit different. South Korea shows ambiguity in terms of promoting the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. South Korea wants to remain ambiguous about this position because a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy is perceived as a containment of China and the Chinese strategies like Belt and Road initiatives. This does not necessarily mean that South Korea is in favor of Belt and Road initiative by Chinese, but it does not want to antagonize China by participating in free and open Indo-Pacific strategy firmly. In terms of the PCA ruling, South Korea made an announcement calling for the respect of international norms, freedom of navigation, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. But it took some moments to come out with this official response. And this response was the result of the urging by the Obama administration. And what we have to pay attention to is the sentence that South Korean government used in the announcement that says the government of the Republic of Korea takes note of the arbitration award issued on July 12 and hopes following the award that the South China Sea disputes will be resolved through peaceful and creative diplomatic efforts. What I highlighted is a takes note. That means that South Korea didn't support the ruling, but takes a note. So which is a lukewarm response to the ruling of the PCA. The South Korea also showed a lukewarm attitude toward the Quad and does not give a clear answer if it joins the Quad. But it is considering its participation in the working group of Quad that deals with the specific issues such as vaccine development and distribution, climate change, which are non-anti-China agendas. Third, challenges related with the US government and particularly under the Trump administration. Under the Trump administration, the United States requested Japan and South Korea to increase their responsibility in the alliance and sharing more burden in the alliance, which had a negative impact on the South Korea's views and Japanese views of the United States. They started to question the United States' extended deterrence, whether it is credible or not, and whether or not the United States is a reliable partner, and which led them to prepare for the worst case scenario where the United States not in the region, and which led them to spend more on the military buildup. And that would inevitably lead to the arms buildup in the region. Such alliance division or decoupling gives an opportunity for China to drive a wedge between the United States and the US allies. And lastly, the last challenge is related with the historical issues between Japan and South Korea. The South Korea's experience in Japan, Japanese imperial occupation of Korea from 1910 and 1945, 30 years occupation, and the related issues are critical impediments for every moment of the cooperation or every phase of cooperation between South Korea and Japan. The termination of GSOMIA that happened in 2019 was caused by the historical problem between South Korea and Japan. And as you know, the GSOMIA, which is General Security of Military Information Agreement, was signed between Japan and South Korea in 2016. And they decided to share the intelligence information between these two countries about the North Korea. And that was sort of the formal security cooperation agreement between South Korea and Japan for the first time in history, but it unfortunately terminated in 2019 because of the historical issues. The Japanese naval ship withdrew from an international fleet review in 2018, which was hosted by the South Korean government, because South Korean government demanded the Japanese not have a rising sun flag, as you can see over here in the Japanese vessel. The Koreans said that this rising sun flag is unbearable because it was used by the Japanese Imperial Naval Force before and during the World War II, and that represents the Japanese military occupation. and also remind South Korean people of these historical atrocities. I mean, these military atrocities conducted by the Japanese military force. I have addressed some major impediments for the trilateral cooperation among Japan, Korea, and the United States that come from the region and that come from within. But this does not necessarily mean that the cooperation among these three countries is impossible, because their interests still converge on the major strategic issues. The three states need to focus on and work on the mending differences constantly and plan out for the long-term strategies. I would like to stop here and give my microphone to the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hyunju. That's a lot for us to think about, and I've already got a million questions, and I'm sure people who've been watching. And the first question is, how dedicated do you have to be to get up at 4:30 in the morning to help educate a bunch of us Canadians? So thank you very much for that. And it's very much appreciated, especially to have somebody who's currently in the region to be able to give us an update on what's going on. And I think similarly, we have another situation for our next speaker with Lauren Richardson. I'm not quite sure what time it is where you are, but thank you very much for joining us, and over to you. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for including me in this dialogue today. I actually woke up at 3:30. My sleep schedule's all over the place, and so I was able to hear the last panel, which I thought was great. So there might be a tiny bit of overlap between my talk and Hyunju's talk, but we articulate things differently. So I think it will ultimately help us to have a deeper understanding of the issue. So I'll be talking about this same trilateral arrangement, but more in relation to North Korea. So as you've just heard from Hyunju, North Korea's nuclear weapons program is one of the flashpoints in the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, however you like to conceptualize the region. And ever since North Korea began to develop nuclear weapons in the 1980s, the United States and its two key Asian allies, Japan and South Korea, have been attempting to persuade North Korea to denuclearize. But the authoritarian nature of the North Korean regime makes this strategic challenge a particularly complex one. Since the beginning of the Cold War, the United States has tried to coordinate its two alliances in East Asia. And the strategic premise for this policy under the Cold War was to achieve a trilateral Cold War network of deterrence among Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington against the trilateral alliance among Beijing, Moscow, and Pyongyang. Washington also hoped that this alliance with South Korea would serve as a shield against Japan from communist military threats, and wanted South Korea aligned with other countries of the free world. Washington was in fact able to achieve a fairly high degree of coordination between these two alliances throughout the Cold War. This objective, though, has become far more difficult in the post-Cold War era for a variety of reasons, which I will elaborate on later. And despite President Biden's affirmation of this objective of cooperating with allies in the face of authoritarianism, I think it will be largely impossible for Biden and his administration to coordinate its policies with its two East Asian allies in dealing with nuclear North Korea. And this is because there are largely irreconcilable differences in the three countries' respective approaches to denuclearization of North Korea. So to make this argument, I'm going to structure my presentation as follows. I'll begin by outlining the convergences and divergences in the three countries' approaches to North Korea and denuclearization more specifically, that have become apparent over the past few years. Following that, I'll look into the reasons behind the deep-rooted divergences between the US, Japan, and South Korea, and we'll offer some concluding remarks after that. So just on the convergences and divergences, the US, Japan, South Korea have similar interests in pursuing denuclearization in North Korea, and they have shared threat perceptions of North Korea's nuclear weapons and ballistic missile program. In short, all three countries are within range of North Korea's missile capabilities, and the nuclear weapons program runs counter to their interests in nuclear non-proliferation. North Korea's missiles not only pose a threat to continental United States, but also to the many US troops stationed in South Korea and Japan. And Japan has also sporadically witnessed North Korean missiles overfly its territory and penetrate its airspace in recent years. So based on this shared threat perception, the three countries regard the denuclearization of North Korea as a high foreign policy priority. And moreover, all three countries have utilized aspects of the same diplomatic toolkit over past years in managing the North Korean nuclear problem. This toolkit has included coercive diplomacy in the form of economic sanctions and threats of military retaliation backed by joint military exercises. Also diplomatic isolation in the form of refusing to meet with North Korean officials, cutting off contact, etc. And also diplomatic engagement in the form of bilateral summitry and multilateral diplomacy, six-party talks, etc. And to a more limited extent, they've used economic engagement. However, they have rarely been able to coordinate the use of these diplomatic tools trilaterally. When then President Donald Trump was toying with the idea of unilaterally launching a limited preemptive strike against North Korea in late 2017, South Korean President Moon Jae-in was holding the door open to dialogue with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, as was his electoral promise. President Moon was also urgently trying to encourage his US ally to refrain from taking military action against North Korea. And shortly thereafter, as the inter-Korea rapprochement began, the North and South Korean leaders agreed to hold a bilateral summit. The South Korean leader then made a diplomatic overture to Trump to encourage him to follow suit, and somewhat surprisingly, he agreed. This ushered in a round of regional summitry, as Kim Jong-un held multiple bilateral summits with the US, South Korea, China, Russia. But missing from this process was Japan. Kim Jong-un refused to meet with Japanese leader Abe Shinzo, which was presumably a result of Abe's stance on the issue of North Korean abductions of Japanese nationals. Instead, Abe had to resort to asking Trump to deliver messages to Kim Jong-un. The failure of the United States to broker a summit meeting between Japan and North Korea undermined, in my mind, the entire regional summit process. And this is because Japan looms large in North Korea's security consciousness and threat perception, and was part of the impetus behind North Korea's drive to develop nuclear weapons. So without security assurances from Japan and a bilateral rapprochement between those two countries, it's really inconceivable that North Korea would be willing to take any steps toward denuclearization. In addition to the lack of coordination in their respective policies toward North Korea, the US, Japan, and South Korea cannot even agree on the pathway that North Korea should take toward denuclearization and the sequencing of steps that this would involve. The three countries also prioritize denuclearization differentially in their respective North Korea policies. So it became apparent in the six-party talks, for instance, that Japan prioritizes the resolution of the abduction issue over the matter of denuclearization. South Korea and the United States, who are arguably the most important actors in the denuclearization negotiations with North Korea, also have vastly different and largely irreconcilable approaches to pursuing this objective. The current South Korean President Moon Jae-in believes it's necessary to first establish a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula before denuclearization can effectively be pursued or achieved. According to him, a peace regime would entail bringing the Korean War to an official end offering economic incentives and other assurances that will create a security environment on the Korean Peninsula that is amenable to denuclearization. The approach of the United States, however, has long been that denuclearization is the first step. The establishment of a peace regime is the second step. From Washington's perspective, ending the Korean War is a kind of concession that should only be offered if steps toward denuclearization are taken first. So in short, there's very little convergence between the US and its two key East Asian allies on how to deal with the North Korea strategic challenge, nuclear North Korea strategic challenge. And just lastly, I'm going to talk about the roots of these divergences. What are the factors that explain the lack of coordination between the US, Japan, and South Korea on dealing with common security threat, not just North Korea, but China, as you've heard too? Of course, we can point to many explanatory factors, but I think there's a deep structural problem at play. And this is essentially the deterioration of what I would call the 1965 regime. 1965 was the year that Japan and South Korea normalized their diplomatic relations, and the United States had a major influence in this process and essentially was the architect behind it and mediated it. The driving force behind all of this was the Cold War imperatives that I outlined in the beginning of my talk. And the logical underpinnings of this normalization process was, anti-communist sentiment, US Cold War strategic objectives, South Korean authoritarianism, Japanese economic interests. All of these interests were kind of institutionalized in the form of a treaty, a normalization treaty, and they became the guiding principles for bilateral cooperation. Over time, however, this logic for cooperation has eroded, and the bilateral relationship has deteriorated accordingly between Japan and South Korea. The last few years, you've heard from Hyun-ju in particular, have been kind of widely cited as the lowest ebb in this bilateral relationship since the countries normalized their ties back in 1965. And as you've also heard, this deterioration is largely a result of the sort of repoliticization of various history problems, the problems that stem from Japan's colonization of Korea. And as a consequence of this process, the 1965 logic that the two countries should get along for security reasons because they're both allies of the United States, it's kind of worn thin in Tokyo and Seoul. And while it makes sense in theory, it discounts the reality that both Japan and Korea kind of weigh their respective positions on history problems above the potential benefits of enhancing trilateral security cooperation. And traditionally, the US has played the role of mediator in this relationship and has stepped in to play this role every time tensions have reemerged. Under Donald Trump, however, Washington uncharacteristically took a back seat in the disputes, and President Trump affirmed that he was only going to mediate if requested to do so by Seoul or Tokyo, and he wasn't. As a result, the bilateral tensions between Japan and South Korea just went into free fall. So the question is now, will Biden be able to help repair the damage and encourage security cooperation between his two key Asian allies? I would argue that it's very unlikely, partly because there's already been a lot of diplomatic damage done to this bilateral relationship by both parties, and also because Washington has lost diplomatic leverage over the bilateral relationship in recent years. And this is mostly a result of the fact that the 1965 normalization treaty between Japan and South Korea has really been delegitimized in South Korea. And this is a process that was driven by non-state actors, mostly the victims of Japan's colonial policies. And therefore, there's little scope for the United States to control this process. Despite this delegitimization, Japan still holds the 1965 treaty front and center in its foreign policy towards South Korea and as the main instrument for managing the bilateral history problems. So to conclude, I think that despite Biden's intentions, it's going to be unlikely that his administration can coordinate the US alliances in East Asia to deal with their perceived rising authoritarianism and mutual security threats. And this cannot simply be understood as a legacy of damage from the Trump administration. There are deeper roots to the divergences that I've outlined above, and therefore they can't be overcome with just diplomatic encouragement. As we've also seen, the divergences have not just manifested between Japan and South Korea, but also the US and Japan and the US and South Korea. In light of this, I think Washington needs to take a radically different approach in order to bring about greater convergence. US officials need to act more as bridge builders than mediators in the Japan-South Korea relationship, and sort of help these two countries to establish a new logic for cooperation, one that's not entrenched in the 1965 Cold War regional order. With regard to the North Korean nuclear challenge, I think the US needs to try to broker a rapprochement between Japan and North Korea to incorporate Japan in the denuclearization talks. And with Prime Minister Abe out of the equation now, this should not be impossible. Secondly, the United States should make more of an effort to reconcile its approach to denuclearization with South Korea's approach. The US-South Korea alliance is premised on the maintenance of Korean peninsula security, not regional security. And given that South Korea shares a border with North Korea, South Korea's diplomatic policy, I think, toward North Korea should take precedence over that of the United States in the context of the alliance the two countries share. And indeed, there are many policymakers in South Korea that they don't regard North Korea as a separate country in the way the US does, but rather they regard North Korea issues as kind of internal issues within one nation. And just to add, I'm going off the script, just flagging for the interpreters. I think Biden, although he's really focused on reassuring allies to repair that damage from the Trump administration, he really hasn't come up with any kind of innovative approach to denuclearization on North Korea. He's really offered nothing yet that's different from what Trump did. So thank you. I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Lauren. It's a real luxury to have two experts in the field be able to cover it from different vantage points. And in fact, what I'm going to do as with my moderator privilege is I'm going to ask the panelists to prepare one question for one of the other panelists. Because you know the topic better than I do, so your questions will undoubtedly be better. So I'll go through, after we do the panel, we'll take questions from the Q&A, but I'll also ask each of the panelists to ask one of the other panelists another question. So now we have our last panelist of the day, of the whole session, in fact. So batting cleanup, we have Nick. Nick, who I understand has had all sorts of excitement, weather excitement also in Australia. Again, thank you very, very much for getting up early to try to make us smarter. Over to you.
Bonjour, Cleo. Hi, everyone. I only got up at six this morning, so I'm not even trying by the sounds of things compared to Lauren and Hyunju. I'm coming to you from Gadigal country, which is about 150 kilometres southwest of Melbourne. They're the traditional owners of what white colonial Australians call the Otways, a very beautiful part of Australia. But we had a spring weather storm come through yesterday. We were without power for about 12 hours, which when you're in the countryside is an issue. You don't get water as well as no power. So it was challenging, but power came on about 8 p.m. last night. So we're okay. And of course, without power, no Zoom, no internet or anything. So fingers crossed, it's much better this morning. So in my remarks, I want to do 4 things. I want to start by providing some of the broader context in which Australian defence strategy operates, because I think it's important to understand that larger context when trying to make sense of the current dynamics of defence cooperation. Then I want to describe that cooperation and provide some key points of the developments in recent years, and particularly to focus on a number of key partnerships that Australia has, and in particular with the United States, and we'll talk a little bit about the brand new kid on the block, AUKUS, which is one of the worst acronyms in world politics. And then I want to finish by sort of talking a bit about the drivers of what's behind Australia's defence cooperation and the dynamics around it. So what's to say, what does it tell us about how cooperation is working and how Australia thinks about its place in the world and its broader defence policy. But to start with the context, Australia has really two big aims for its defence strategy that loom above all else. One is stated very openly and clearly, the other is a little less public for reasons that I hope will become obvious. The first is that Australia wants to have a stable and favourable balance of power in the region. And it has enjoyed that for really the century and a bit since the Federation of Australia in 1901. The second aim that it has is to ensure that it always has access to as much of the most sophisticated warfighting capability as it can afford. It has long been aware that it is much richer, much more developed than its immediate neighbours, and it always wants to be able to cultivate, to turn that advantage into material capabilities, which will give it an edge over anyone who's thinking about attacking Australia in any sense. And to step back a little bit, it's important to understand that from an Australian point of view, there's a sort of fundamental security challenge that the country has and has had since white settlement. And that is, it is an enormous territory. It's basically a continent. It has one of the world's largest exclusive economic zones. It is extremely well endowed in terms of natural resources, but it has a very, very small population, about 25 million people or so now. And so it has always been acutely aware that it is unable to defend itself, understood in a really basic sense, because of that imbalance between the scale of its interests and the size of its population. Even with that very significant resource endowment, it's still not got the capabilities to defend, and will never, in its own thinking, have the capabilities to defend its interests in the main. And there's also, without wanting to dig too deep into the strategic culture of Australian thinking, there is also underneath it the realisation that the dispossession that lies at the heart of the creation of modern Australia, that is, the British showed up and took the place from the Indigenous inhabitants, that dispossession is at the heart of how Australia thinks about itself. Not publicly, it's never stated, but we're acutely aware of what we, white Australians, did to the Indigenous population could well happen to us. And that was really clear in the 19th century when we were talking and thinking about Australia's place in the world, particularly the colonial societies. So that sense of vulnerability has always been resolved by cooperation with others, and in particular with partnership with Britain in the first half of the 20th century, and now with the United States in the second half of the 20th century. And so Australian defence policy has really hardwired into its operations defence cooperation. And in particular, the alliance with the United States is fundamental both to the security of Australia. So if the alliance were to disappear tomorrow, Australia would have to fundamentally reorder everything to do with its defence strategy and policy from the ground up. So defence cooperation is really hardwired into Australian defence policy. As a consequence of that, everything that Australia does in its defence policy is sort of organised around those big goals. That's to say, how do we get a stable and favourable balance of power, and how do we ensure we have access to the highest quality warfighting capabilities? And happily, the answer to that is servicing the alliance relationship with the United States. So the United States, from the Australian point of view, the United States is key to ensuring a stable and favourable balance of power. And of course, the United States is key to Australia accessing that high-end warfighting capabilities. Now, that's not to say everything that Australia does in its defence policy is organised around the US and nothing else happens. There's a whole range of other things that occur to do with regional engagement, non-traditional security concerns, peacekeeping operations, defence diplomacy, but all of those are subordinate to those larger aims. And if there's ever trade-offs, those larger aims will always prevail. So to get to the details of defence cooperation, Australia is very active in defence cooperation, and not just in managing that bilateral relationship with the United States. It's been very active for at least 2 decades. It has been principally centred on our region, which, as Lauren was alluding to, we're in a bit of a moment of transition as to what we call our region, and I don't want to get into the arguments about what to call it. Lauren and I were involved in a dialogue earlier this week, which we spent a lot of time unpicking what the Indo-Pacific means. Happy to tell you some backstory if you're interested in the Australian debate about that. But Australia's defence cooperation is very regionally focused, and I think can be divided really into 2 phases. There's a sort of 2001 to 2016 period, and then there's a 2017 onward period. Between 2001 and 2016, cooperation was really driven by the management of the alliance with the United States, but also a strategy of, at that point in time, Australia is seeking to have positive, engaged relations with every great power in the region. So that's not just the US, but also Japan, China, and India. And the relationship with China at that point was seen as one that could be positive. We were never going to get everything we wanted, but really up until 2016, there was a sense that China was not only our most important economic partner, but it was a country with whom you could get along to some degree. And in fact, up until in 2014, formally Australia entered into a special strategic partnership, as it's described, with China, which, if you look back only 7 years later, looks quite astonishing and also very dated as a sentiment. And then the third element of that defence cooperation during this period was non-traditional security, and in particular concerns around terrorism in the wake of September 11th and through, and particularly after the Bali bombing, in which many Australians died in a nightclub bombing in the resort town, one of the resort towns in Bali. The pursuit of terrorism and cooperation to advance that end was a very significant part of what we did. From 2017, though, things began to change, and it really became driven much more overtly by concerns around China in general, and in particular about the threat China posed to that big, high-order ambition of Australian strategy. That is to say, perception in Canberra moved and began to see China not as a country with whom we could get along, but as a principal challenge to that stable and favourable balance of power. Now, whether that judgment is right, and I'll get to one of the issues around defence cooperation later, but that fundamental shift in attitude in Canberra is crucial to understanding how Australia approaches its defence cooperation and its defence policy more broadly. So what have we been doing in all of this, and with whom have we been doing it? As I said, by far the most significant developments have occurred in the relationship with the United States, and not just the recent announcement about submarine technology. We have been, since really 2001, developing an extraordinarily close relationship at almost every level in defence and security terms and intelligence terms with the United States. And it began with September 11th. And I'll say a little bit, I'll dig a bit more into the detail of it once I've quickly sketched through some of the other countries and developments, because I think the American story is probably the one everyone's most interested in because of the subs, but also I think it tells you a bit more about, because it's such an important part of what Australia does. The second key country with whom we've been cooperating significantly is Japan. Japan and Australia are often described now, incorrectly, but often described in the public sort of press and discussions as having an alliance relationship. Now, of course, we don't have an alliance relationship, but we do have an extensive set of security cooperation agreements, both formal treaty level documents and working groups and cooperative operations. And certainly after the United States, both Japan and Australia view one another as each other's most important security partner in the region after the US. And of course, for both countries, the US, it looms very, very large in their defense policy. The third tier are two partnerships, one with Singapore and one with Indonesia, that are on paper wide-ranging. So with both countries, we have formal security cooperation agreements that cover a broad range of issue areas. With Singapore, they're much more substantive, involve a lot more direct interactions, everything from military exchanges to providing opportunities for the Singapore Defence Force to train in Australia. You know, those who've been to Singapore know there's not a lot of places you can do live action training operations on that island, and Australia, we've got plenty of territory in which you can do that. In Indonesia, the cooperation began and has really only been particularly successful in relation to terrorism and crime, those sorts of non-traditional security areas. And in recent years, the relationship has not been managed particularly well, and so the broad-based ambitions of the security cooperation have not been realised to the extent to which I think some in Australia would like it to be. The next tier down, I think, is the security cooperation with India and more broadly with the Quad. And I bracket those two together because Australia has a view around India that it is a partnership with whom, sorry, it's a country with whom we should have a much better partnership on all fronts, both economic and security, and we've never managed to turn that potential that Australia sees it into reality. There has been some bilateral efforts on the security cooperation front that have led to naval exercises and a few working groups, but at this stage, it's not progressed too much further. The Quad, however, has got much more, at least political dynamic around it and a lot more momentum now. And we've seen that move pretty swiftly from being dormant from 2007 until 2017, and then relatively swiftly be ramped up to something that certainly, if you're sitting in the ASEAN Secretariat, you're looking at the Quad and going, we've got a challenger on our fronts in the sense that ASEAN is a regional organisation that wants to be at the heart of all cooperative endeavours in Southeast Asia, and it sees the Quad as muscling in on that territory. And when you've got an organisation with the US, Japan, India, okay, Australia, but those three together operating politically in quite a significant, prominent way, that tells you a little bit about where you're going to feel a little concerned. At the fifth level, I think Australia's been a pretty active operating in the regional institutions to do with security cooperation, but I think the bandwidth challenge that Australia has, that's to say the kind of resources that it's got to invest in all of these things, mean that the priorities are not as heavily placed on things like the ASEAN Regional Forum or the security aspects of the East Asia Summit or other elements, because they're seen as less significant, and we've just got fewer resources to do it in comparison to servicing relationship with Singapore or with Japan or with the US. And there's also a sense, I think, that these institutions to do with security cooperation really aren't working particularly effectively to deliver those sort of ambitions that Australia has. Because remember, if priority one is a stable and a favourable balance of power in Asia, and you perceive that as at risk, the ASEAN Regional Forum is not going to help you fix that problem or provide a better resolution to that challenge. And then more recently, we've also begun to explore security partnerships or relationships with doing defence cooperation with the Philippines and with Vietnam, but they're very much in their infancy. So let me say a little bit more about the United States and then get to the sort of dynamics and drivers, and then I'll stop and we can get into Q&A and discussion. So as I said, with the United States, this is by far the most important part of our defence cooperation. And it's not just the most important part of our defence cooperation, it's the most important part of Australian defence policy. And indeed, the alliance has started to become capitalised, and it's often referred to in these semi-reverential tones. And the current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, described it as the Forever Alliance, which, if you're a student of international history, that sort of alliances aren't forever. No relationships are forever. Interests are eternal. Relationships are not. That sort of sits very uneasily, I think, with that. But it is a big deal in the Australian context. As I said, it began with the September 11 attacks. We really began to significantly enhance our relationship with the US after September 11th, and were very significant participants in the global war on terror, relatively speaking, certainly prominent. And you saw the Australian government at the time take a very controversial decision to be involved in the war in Iraq, which was presented in the same ways as all participation in the war in Iraq was presented. But what it was really about was servicing the alliance relationship. You'll never get anyone on record to confirm that publicly, or there'll be nothing in the diplomatic archive around it. But at its heart, the sense was we are a partner with the United States, and this is this time when America has been challenged, and this is how we repay that debt, so to speak. But it wasn't just about military deployments. We've established the Australia-US ministerial dialogues, which are these 2+2 structure with the foreign minister and the defense minister getting together annually. And if you go through all of the ministerial statements over a period of time, over the decade and a half or so since they've become a key part of managing the relationship, you'll see the agenda, you'll see kind of laid out over time, not just the broadening range of cooperative endeavours, but the extent to which the alliance is seen by both parties as a broad-ranging element that's not just about a narrow conception of defence and security, but about coordinating bilateral relationship on almost every sphere. And it's developed strongly on this basis. And in fact, if you've got the time, it's worth looking at these documents, because you can see it sketched the expansion of this relationship, but you can also see them get longer and longer and longer. So the most recent one, I think, stretches out to about 16 pages of detail. A lot of it is diplomatic signalling, but it gives you a sense as to the scale of this expansion of this relationship. And over time, we've begun, particularly under the Obama administration, you began to see the defence relationship turning into very concrete material cooperative endeavours. Most surprisingly to those of us who've been watching this relationship closely over a long period of time, the decision to allow American Marines to be stationed in the north of Australia outside Darwin on a 6-monthly rotational basis raised almost no eyebrows when it began shortly after 2011 and was ramped up to its full capacity by about 2016. Up until that point, I think the idea of Australian hosting American troops was seen as a bit of a red line that no one wanted to cross because it was potentially really controversial, and yet it was seen as almost a non-issue. And I think in part because of that long period of development of the relationship with the United States. And that brings us, given time constraints, there's a bit more I could dig into, but given the time, I'll skip on to AUKUS and what we've got now. So we had the announcement on, it seems a little while ago now, but just a couple of months ago, that announcement very suddenly, in which we managed to badly alienate the French, upset most of our regional neighbours, and announced what is, without wanting to be too blunt about it, was basically a technology sharing agreement what is basically a statement of intent to develop shared capabilities in nuclear-powered submarines over the next 18 months, and a range of other tech sharing agreements in AI and the like. That's all it is at the moment. And given the current Australian government's current inability to turn statements and press conferences into actual policy outcomes, I wouldn't hold your breath too much about it. Now, I don't want to understate the significance of Australia saying it can acquire, and it will seek to acquire, nuclear-powered submarines. It's a big deal when any country does that. And the US saying it's prepared to share this technology is also a significant deal. But this is very much in keeping with that long-term trend of Australia binding itself to the United States. There's nothing really new here beyond the technology in terms of the politics and the dynamics of it. It doesn't make a difference to the strategic balance in any significant sense. And of course, the submarines aren't going to be in the water until 2040 at the earliest. But I think it tells you a bit about how Australia sees the region, which is it's very, very worried about it. Now, whether it's right to be as worried as it is about it is another question. I think Australia badly overstates the threat that China poses to that stable and favourable balance of power. But also, and crucially, it sees its future as being inextricably tied to the United States, because what the tech sharing agreement of AUKUS says is that essentially our submarine fleet is going to be not entirely subordinated to the US Navy, but effectively, we're not going to be able to operate without the US Navy. And as such, we're basically saying that we think, as far as we're concerned, we are tied to the US forever. The US will be in the region forever, and that's all manageable. Now, the question, of course, is the puzzle in my mind around all of this is, didn't 2016 teach us anything? That's to say, the election of Trump, I think, gave everyone who watches the US in the world a really useful lesson, and that's to say, a country like the United States will not always think about its interests in the same way forever, and you cannot assume that it always will. And for Australia to tie itself so tightly to the United States forecloses some flexibility in its international policy in general and its defence and strategy in particular, which, given the fluidity of the regional environment, does seem to me to be something of a puzzle. Let me just finish with a couple of questions, just a few key points, observations around the dynamics of this cooperation, and then I'll stop. Jonathan set us in the research puzzle a few key questions, so I'll just try to frame my comments directly to those issues. What's driving Australia's defence security cooperation at the moment is, of course, first and foremost about China, and about trying to protect the regional order that has existed for decades, in which the US is the primary power in the region, in which there's a stable balance of power. No one threatens US hegemony, and no one is able to undermine it or challenge it. Australia is prepared to do more to try to advance that goal, but is also trying to ensure that the US is bound into the region. And I think there's an interesting element around, an interesting dynamic around the acquisition of the submarines, which is two-way, and that's the sense that, one, we are tying ourselves to the United States, but through it, Australia believes that it can also, through the submarine agreement, can bind the US into the region as well. Because, so the thinking goes, if we get a more America first, Trump-like foreign policy from the US, the more institutional agreement, military forms that you have to tie America into the region, the lower your risks are that it will absent the field, as it has done, and as both Lauren and Hyunju have described with the Korea-Japan relationship. And of course, Australia is keen for others to share its views. So Australia is keen to develop its collaborative relationship with Japan, as much for the two of them to do things together, but also to help facilitate Japan play a greater role. I think if you gave Australian policymakers and strategists and said, what's one thing that you could wish for in the region beyond America always being here, it would be for Japan to be playing a strategic role in the region commensurate with its scale. And of course, there are all these strategic reasons, these political reasons why that's not possible. But if you're trying to balance Chinese power, if you're someone who feels concerned about the expansion of authoritarian China in the region, then a militarily capable democratic Japan could play a very significant role in balancing that power. Now, that would require the strategic fairy godmother, because it's not going to happen. But that's the sentiment that is out there in the land. And finally, just to explain my rigidity in the face of fluidity subtitle, Australia is not, as I've described, Australia is not rigid in the sense of not doing anything and stuck in old ways. In fact, it's quite entrepreneurial and being a very key part in important new developments in the region, like the Quad and like AUKUS. But the thinking that lies behind that entrepreneurial activity in defence cooperation is very rigid, in the sense that it's predicated on a very fixed view of how the region will work. It's somewhat backward looking, in the sense it's trying to retain an old order in the face of very significant change. And it's rigid in the sense that Australia is tied into a very narrow path for its foreign and defence policy because of the commitment it has made to the United States. Now, it may be that it sees that there is a high level of path dependence in this. That's to say, the choices we've made in the past mean that there really isn't any other option than to tie yourself to the United States. But it does seem to me that in the face of really world historical dynamic change in East Asia, to foreclose a whole set of options is not a particularly wise move at this point in time. I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was very interesting. I know there are a lot of questions related to Australia, and I think that when you're listening to your description of Australia before, with a small population, a large territory, and a colonial background, I think a lot of people were thinking there, but for the grace of geography goes Canada. And what would we do if we were stuck out in the middle of the Pacific in terms of our defense strategy? We've been, I think, our lives have been made perhaps complicated, but also fundamentally easier by living next to our major security provider. So it's interesting to hear how you've had to deal with it. I have just a few quick comments. My area is actually India, and it's interesting as you're talking about the Quad and talking about the region. There's a consistent reference to damage done during the Trump administration. The US-India relationship was fundamentally strengthened during the last 4 years, during the Trump, especially the last 2 or 3 years, with a lot of things like signing of BECA and intelligence sharing agreements, and the reinvigoration of the Quad, and the refocusing of PACOM to Indo-PACOM to bring India much more into the region. And Japan, I know also, especially under Abe, found the Trump administration helpful in a lot of ways for its security structure. So just as something to wonder about, was the Trump administration all bad in the case of Indo-Pacific security alliances? And was it really less present? Or when you look at the sort of logistics agreements that were signed and that sort of thing on the ground, was defense cooperation in the region actually reinforced? So if you want to think about that, and for Nick, I'm going to come back to you on the Pacific Islands, because in the context of the Five Eyes, which we're obviously a partner of, we would look to Australia to lead on the Pacific Islands, which is a vast strategic area, but which wasn't in your list of even not 5th, 6th, or 7th. And we came very close last week to what looked like an insurrection in the Solomon Islands, triggered by CCP interference in the central government's relationship with one of its provinces. So in the region, the country that is really on the brink of CCP triggered instability is the Solomon Islands, which we would look to Australia to take leadership on. So where is Australia on the Pacific Islands in terms of creating stability in the region in the context of an expansionist China, and the Australian responsibilities in the context of the Five Eyes to be on the forefront of that discussion? So I'll come back to you on that, but because we've moved a little bit away from South Korea, I'd like to ask both Lauren and Hyun-Ju, there is an election coming up in 2022, a presidential election coming up, and the Conservatives won the 2 big mayoral elections. So given your very comprehensive analysis of what's going on now, do you think that, what do you think might happen in 2022? And would it change any of the things you've talked about? I'll go to you first, Hyun-Ju.
Thank you, Cleo, for the excellent question. What would happen to Korea after the presidential election in 2022? Well, frankly speaking, I don't know what's going to happen, but we can expect that there are 2 options available. One is conservative, the other is liberal. And Liberal Progressive Party already chosen the presidential candidate, Lee Jae-myung. And he is regarded as very extremely progressive, and he was a lawyer, and he worked as he couldn't graduate he couldn't get the normal education when he was growing up because he was extremely poor. So he is supportive of the labor, the rights, and he got a lot of support from the labor union. And he is trying to be a little bit expand the support by addressing these conservative agendas like the relationship with the United States, the importance of the United States. Beforehand, he was very critical of the United States when he was running for the mayor a long time ago, when he became a mayor. And now he's a governor of the, not now, but he was a governor of the Gyeonggi province, which is the major province in South Korea. So he was very left before, but he's moving toward in the middle. And I think he has an intention to do so in order to cover these major agendas related with security issues, the North Korea and the United States. But if he would be elected, he would maintain the strategic agenda that was supported by Hyon, who was progressive leader, and also the Moon Jae-in, the current leader, in a sense that he wants to focus on this conversation and dialogue with North Korea continuously. But at the same time, the backbone of the US-Korea relationship has to be maintained in order to promote the cooperation with, in order to promote that dialogue with North Korea. So the emphasis is still placed on this improvement relationship with North Korea, but at the same time, the focus, the US-Korea relationship should be maintained and secured. And at the same time, the relationship with China would be also highlighted, in a sense that, as I mentioned really briefly in the presentation, that the reason why South Korea is reluctant and ambiguous about this position in the Indo-Pacific strategy and the Quad is related with the Chinese factor. The China as an important factor to bring the North Korea into the discussion table, and China, from the South Korea perspective, is some influence in North Korea in many ways, because China's North Korea relations, China constitutes the 80% of North Korea's trade with the foreign countries, and to that extent, the South Korean people believe that China has a huge influence. So the importance of China is going to be emphasized, and the South Korea's strategic ambiguity is going to be continued. But that does not necessarily mean that the conservative leader is going to be strongly against the Chinese or strongly against North Korea. But I think the security issues, both liberal and the conservative leader would focus on the US-Korea relations, the focus on the dialogue with North Korea, and also focus on this importance of the China as a regional the partner.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very helpful. And while we have you thought up your question for one of the other panelists?
Yes, I have. I was very much enjoyed by Lawrence and the Nick's presentation, and my question is directed. First question is directed to Lauren, in a sense that frankly speaking, this question should be asked to me too, but I don't have really a good answer to this right now. The question is, as we talked about this deterioration of bilateral relationship between Japan and South Korea, what could we do to improve the relations between the two? This Korea-Japan relationship hit the rock bottom, and the Moon Jae-in government is, he says that he's trying to improve the relationship, but it doesn't seem like, that under his administration, it's not going to be improved. So what should be done in order to improve relations between Japan and South Korea? And also my question is also directed to Nick, related with Australia. I was very much interested in the Australia's the strategic position. And nowadays, the Korean people talk a lot about Australia. Australia as a middle power, and a good example of South Korea's good. I mean, Australia is self-representative of a good example of how South Korea should do in dealing with China, particularly these days. I mean, Australia's participation in the US sanctions against the Huawei or 5G network, and the Australia's, but at the same time, improve relations with the China on various issues. But my question is, how have Australian people ever questioned the US commitment to the region at all? Particularly after the withdrawal of the US forces from Afghanistan. Without I mean, not major, but some Korean people questioned about the US commitment in the Korean Peninsula. Would the United States withdraw forces from the Korean Peninsula in the end, after seeing this withdrawal of forces in Afghanistan? So has Australia ever questioned or curious, I mean, have ever become suspicious about the US commitment in the region or in Australia?
Thank you very much, Andrew, for those great questions. And Lauren, if you have anything to say about the election, and also if you were president of the United States, what policies you'd put in place to try to make things better, or even, in fact, if you're anybody who, I don't even know if the US should be involved. You can tell us whether the US should even be involved. Over to you.
Okay, I'll just pick up on a few of those things. So with the election, Hyunju's done a great job of talking about what it might mean for, North Korea, China. I'll move on to what it might mean for Japan, and also get to Hyunju's question about how to improve Japan-Korea relations. I actually just gave a talk on this topic yesterday about what role does leadership play, or leadership transition, in Japan-Korea relations. And sadly, at the moment, I don't think it's going to play much of a role at all. And that's because, as I mentioned before, a lot of the tensions between Japan and Korea are driven at the non-state level. They're mostly, the thing that's mostly driving all the tension over recent years is the lawsuits by Korean victims of Japanese colonial policies. They launched the lawsuits in Korean courts, and they keep winning. And it's likely if there's any more lawsuits, they're probably going to win again. So it means that any South Korean leader, it doesn't matter if they're conservative or progressive, which party they're affiliated with, the basic choices they face is, to what extent do we enforce these rulings against Japan? There's a feeling we have to enforce them. And how do we enforce them? And the minute they start enforcing them, Japan's default position is, we need to defend the treaty we signed at all costs. And so things are really bad, until those lawsuits stop. I don't see there's much room for improving the relationship. But what I do think, if I'm being a bit idealistic, I think we need to move away from that US pressure, that kind of trilateral arrangement to help, it's kind of always undergirded by a threat. If you two don't behave yourself, I'm not going to support the alliance or whatever. I think we need to move away from that. And maybe I'm actually writing a paper at the moment about the potentials for Australia, Japan, and Korea to work together on capacity building in Southeast Asia, hydrogen economy, hydrogen energy links, things like that, things that will help to build sort of new bridges between them, that might sort of provide some diplomatic incentives for them to keep the history problems contained rather than spilling over into the defense and economic relationship. And just on Cleo's question, it was actually, I think, directed toward Nick about, the damage Trump did to Indo-Pacific alliances. I would say there was definitely damage to the US-South Korea alliance. That was one alliance that took a beating with Trump. I mean, not only did Trump, engage in very aggressive cost-sharing negotiations with South Korea that caused a lot of strain. At the same time, he didn't like President Moon. He was, again, caused so much worry in Korea when he was prepared to launch a limited strike on North Korea, which could have evolved into a nuclear war. He even ordered the evacuation of US troops from South Korea. And fortunately, the US leader in charge in South Korea failed to carry that out, knowing it would have set in motion a catastrophic chain of consequences. And there's also, Trump, criticized the movie Parasite for winning awards. He was just brutal towards South Korea. And there's a sense in South Korea that he could be reelected. Someone like him could be reelected. And that's definitely kind of encouraging South Korea to look at Australia and other countries as, potential security partners. So yeah, I think that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Much appreciated. Now we have 10 minutes before we have to close this, and we have a bunch of questions also in the chat, which have to do, because we're Canadian, so we have to ask you, where does Canada fit in all of this? And there's also some questions about the difference between the debate over Asia Pacific and Indo-Pacific. So Nick, you've had a lot of questions pointed your way. Feel free to ignore the ones you aren't interested in and pick up the ones you are interested in, and then just leave a little bit of time so that we could go back and visit the other two as well. And Laura, actually, Laura, we didn't even get your question, so for somebody else, so we can't even throw that one in, unless, Lauren, you have a very quick question for somebody.
Okay, yeah, just a quick question to Nick. I kind of got the sense from the last panel, listening to Stephanie and other speakers, that from Canada's perspective, it looks like the US regards Australia as a really important ally. But, obviously we regard the US as one, but when you compare to how the US looks at Japan and South Korea, really formidable alliances. And, people in Washington that come to Canberra sometimes say to me, no one in the US talks about Australia. There's hardly any experts on the US-Australia alliance in DC, but there's so many on US-Japan, US-Korea. Yeah, just kind of wondering what you think about how the US actually views us as an ally. Are we really?
That's your 87th question, Nick, and now you have 3 to 4 minutes to answer them all. Over to you.
Okay, I'll try to be quick and not murder the interpreter. On the Pacific Islands, the reason I didn't mention it is because of the way Australia thinks about what it does with the Pacific Islands. So it looks at the Pacific through almost exclusively a kind of development lens. And Australia has historically been and remains the biggest biggest development aid provider. It has significantly enhanced its focus on the Pacific since 2016, driven primarily by these concerns around China, at very significant prodding by the Americans in particular. Australia's focus on the Pacific is very uneven and sporadic. There are two big problems or challenges that Australia faces in its regional engagement in the Pacific Islands. One is it's seen rightly by recipient countries as very instrumental. You're only interested in us because the Chinese are interested in us. And second is climate change. We are so hopelessly bad on climate change, and that is the #1 issue for those countries. So that was why I kind of left it out. It's clearly there and we're doing things, but it sort of operates in a slightly different dynamic than the sort of core defense security cooperation elements. There was a question, I think, from Remy on the nuclear weapons. One of the nuclear issues, so one of the things that has really struck me about the submarine debate and discussion has been the absence of any real concerns around the nuclear side of it. Because when the first decision was made and the debate leading up to the decision in 2016, the size and scale of the vessels was sort of all, how big should they be? How should they be powered? And the nuclear option was taken off the table very quickly for two reasons. One, the publicly stated one, which was the complexity of the engineering and the complete lack of any capacity in Australia in industry or engineering to do any support supply. The whole thing would just be implausible, which it remains. But the other is, of course, the politics of it. The sense in 2015, I think 2016 was, apart from the engineering issue, the politics of a nuclear powered sub was just too fraught. Fast forward to now, and no one blinked the idea of nuclear powered submarines. I mean, lots of debate around the engineering and all this sort of thing. there's been one effort, one publicly stated point that got a bit of press from one of the Green MPs to say, you know, we'll have floating Chernobyls in every Australian city. But that was it. And what that says to me is I think the sensitivities around the nuclear question have been, I think, eroded principally because of the height of the concerns around China, and in particular, and without wanting to eat up too much time, the public debate about China and Australia has been for some time deeply securitized, so that the public interventions about the threat that China poses to Australia have been really heavily weighed and influenced by the security hawks. In particular, the intelligence agencies have had a thumb on the scale on this one for years. I mean, years and years, like leaking stuff to journalists, to even coming out of the heads of intelligence agencies coming out publicly saying the drumbeats of war, China presents a threat. So that context, whatever the motives may be, whether they're pure or whatever, that's provided a context that's very amenable to this. So I think, you know, could Australia get nuclear weapons? Not anytime soon, but I think it's a much more plausible scenario now than it was 2 months ago, when I would have thought, no, that's a real third rail issue.
Thank you. Sorry, if we're gonna, we're gonna have to move on. But thank you very much. Yeah. So Lauren, do you want to talk to us about Canada, about how Canada is viewed in the region? You have about 2 minutes.
So I'll just speak very briefly. Interestingly, you know, I teach diplomacy at ANU in the diplomacy program, and Canada always comes up in discussions of Australia as a middle power. Canada's the other classic middle power, South Korea is the other one. And so I think it's quite interesting. You know, it's almost like, yeah, it seems to only come up in that context in the worlds that I sort of move in. And I think, interestingly, Australia seems to have a very mixed identity, you know, foreign policy identity. Nick could obviously speak to this more than me, but, you know, on the one hand, we are part of these middle power groupings like MICTA. You know, whenever I attend an Australia-Korea dialogue, it's all about we're both middle powers, right? But then you look at the Quad AUKUS, you know, trying to play with the big guns all the time. You know, most of the security dialogues that happen in Australia are, you know, framed in this Indo-Pacific, you know, Indo-Pacific terms. And we don't talk that much about players outside the Indo-Pacific, you know, a little bit about Europe, but not so much about Canada. I never heard Canada come up in those topics. And I'm sad to say, I don't get the sense that, you know, Canada is regarded as having a big role in this region. Sorry to say that. Nick might want to ask.
Thank you. Hyon, are you going to try to, can you make us feel a little bit more important?
I'm so sorry. I have to say the same thing.
Yeah, I agree. But the one thing I would say, though, is Canada is seen as almost entirely absent, almost totally, which is surprising if you sort of step back from it, particularly if you think about the early 90s when Canada was much more present as, say, part of APEC. I mean, it partly reflected that Pacific Rim sense of the region, and now, if you buy the Indo-Pacific argument, it's even it's even less Pacific Rim now. It's Indian Ocean and Western Pacific. But I think there's real potential for Canada. I think it's not literally like there's an empty chair, but as a significant trading nation, liberal in both the sense of democratic, but also interested in open free trade, that sort of thing. Another voice at the table, another advocate for broadly conceived liberal democratic rights, and also a country that isn't obsessed about the military. Because the other thing about defense and security stuff in the region at the moment is it's so guns and tanks and bombs. It's so focused on warfighting. And we need more multilateralists. We need more creative diplomats. We need more political leadership. And Canada could completely do that if it was committed to it. And I think there's a strong history on it, but there is the absence is really, I think, is quite notable.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think there are some excellent voices throughout the course of the whole day talking about where the potential is within Canada to do a bit more. We are going to give the last word to Hyon, who woke up so early in order to be able to join us. Do you have any from being there at the moment, South Korea? What do you hope would happen in the next 2 to 3 years that could make the situation better?
You mean the region in general, or?
Yeah, or whatever you think is important to you. If you could wave a magic policy wand and it would happen immediately, what do you think we should be watching for?
Well, first of all, I asked this question to Lauren, but first of all, we have to improve the relationship with Japan. That is the most important thing. And the South Korea has to get out of this, it's actually very limited to, its perception is very limited to how to deal with North Korea. It has to get outside of the box and think about these multilateral relations with Canada and Australia and the Southeast Asian region. And we have to go beyond. So I would like to stop that there.
Thank you very much. And thank you for including us in the list. And I think this whole day has really been about thinking outside the box and re-questioning where we are and trying to figure out where we want to go. And for that, I'm truly grateful to the network for setting this up, and to Jonathan Paquin for bringing us all together and letting us learn from each other and challenge each other and be brutally honest, as Stephanie Carvin just put it, with each other. So I'm handing it back over to headquarters with gratitude and a lot to think about. Bye.
Thank you, Cleo. Thank you very much to all of you for a great panel. I really enjoyed it. And I also enjoyed it because you guys woke up pretty early for a Saturday morning. So it's much appreciated. Now, this conference was supposed to be, well, initially it was supposed to be a workshop in 2019 prior to COVID, and then we had to postpone it a couple of times. Unfortunately, we were not able to meet in person in Quebec City. It would have been great. Hopefully, we will be able to do something like that, in the coming years. That's certainly something that I would hope for. So I would like to conclude quickly. It's already 5 p.m. here in Quebec City. I'd like to thank all of the panelists. We had people from Switzerland, from the UK, from Denmark, from Canada, from many provinces, and now we have you from South Korea and Australia. It has been quite a day. And so again, thank you very much. I would like to thank the Department of National Defense for the money we received to put up this conference. Now, as for the main takeaways of this conference, and I will switch to French because, as you know, Canada is a bilingual country, so and we have translators, so you can always click if you want the translation. Mais je pense que nos conférenciers ont noté.
So I think that our panelists today have noted that a lot of coordination is necessary between the allied states, and this coordination is often limited to geographical blocks for obvious reason, and there is a preoccupation with those questions that are immediate rather than on a much wider scale in regions that are geographically far, even if they are democracies. Some of the tendencies that we saw during the day, Europe autonomy and strategy, which is accelerating, and at the same time, what does come up is that consensus is not present as for the role of the US, and there is important tension between the European Union members on this question, and there are various positions. There is the Chinese threat, and especially the Russian threat. As for the UK and Australia, it seems that things are altogether clear, namely since the AUKUS agreement. This suggests greater strategic closeness with the US. I've been observing Australia in the last few years with a few other colleagues, and we had the impression that Australia was working on several fronts, edging in a way within its alliance with the States, but also entertaining cooperation with other South Pacific partners, Japan, Korea, and so on. And we thought that there was geographical diversification, but with AUKUS, it seems that very clear decisions were made, which brings us back to the central ally of the Australians, that is the US. There's also strategic ambiguity with some of the allies, namely in South Korea, namely with respect to the Quad. This was brought up earlier on. What did surprise me throughout the day is that there is relatively little strategic thought, reflection between the democracies throughout the world with respect to authoritarianism. And a common front, a democratic common front before authoritarianism, we can formulate it conceptually, but it's not so easy to bring it on the ground, perhaps because people are not quite hungry enough for a global approach in this respect. So we're not there yet. Maybe we will never be, and maybe regional logic will continue to lead orientation of the various democracies.
My research assistants. First of all, Pierre Colotti gave me a lot of material when we started to work on this project together in 2019. And then again, as I said, there was COVID. And then Remy Carugati, another research assistant, came for the second phase that eventually led to the final program that you've seen. And so thank you very much to both of them. And my last word is to all of you. I wish you a great weekend, and hopefully we'll see each other at another time. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Bon weekend.
Bon weekend.